Good morning and welcome to South Carolina Social Studies. Today we are going to be talking about the secession of South Carolina. Again, secession means to withdraw from, and this is South Carolina Social Studies Standard 8 4.4. This standard reads: evaluate the arguments of unionists, cooperationists, and secessionists on the issues of states' rights and slavery, and the way that their arguments contributed to South Carolina's secession. Our essential questions are as follows. What were the arguments of Unionists, Cooperationists, and Secessionists on the issues of states' rights and slavery? And how did they contribute to South Carolina's secession from the Union? We're ready to begin. Here's a quote. Members of the South Carolina Secession Convention in 1860 vote unanimously to secede from the Union. However, there were South Carolinians who strongly discouraged secession prior to the national election of 1860. And we know who got elected in 1860, right? Yes, Abraham Lincoln. Unionists favored the ideas of remaining a part of the Union. Although Unionists did not necessarily agree with the actions of the northern states of the federal government, they believed that the U.S. Constitution was well equipped to protect South Carolina's way of life. And we know that's talking mainly about slavery and the ideas behind slavery. So again, Unionists favored the idea of remaining a part of the Union. The next group that we had at the Secession Convention were Cooperationists. Cooperationists were South Carolinians who favored seceding from the Union. However, this was the last resort, and only if it was done with the support of all the southern states. So they did not want to withdraw from the Union unless everybody went with them, okay? So again, that's cooperationists. So you have Unionists who want to remain with the Union. Next, you have the cooperationists who favor seceding from the Union, but they only wanted to do it as a last resort, and if they have all the support of the other southern states. They believed that it would be a big mistake for South Carolina to secede without the cooperation and support of other states. Of course, we know that did not happen because South Carolina went ahead and seceded anyway. They were the first to do so, and then the other states followed suit. Next up, you have the radicals. On the other hand, secessionists, also known as radical or fire eaters, argued that breaking away from the Union was the only answer for South Carolina. They believed that the issue was not debatable and had been ready to secede since early as 1852. So these were your radical people who were ready to just leave, okay? So again, you have the three types. You have the Unionists who want to remain with the Union. Then you have the cooperationists who only want to do it as a last resort and with the support of all the other southern states. But then you have the radicals who have been ready to just walk out of the Union that we now call the United States, okay? It's not a debatable issue. They wanted to break away, called radicals or fire eaters, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, the events that led to the events of the 1850s and the election of 1860 convinced most South Carolinians to support the position of the fire eaters. Again, that's the radicals. When it became clear that Lincoln was to be the 16th president of the United States, the leaders of South Carolina carried through with their threat to secede. Again, Abraham Lincoln gets elected. He's a free soil candidate. He does not want the spread of slavery into the Western Territory. Again, he was not an abolitionist, so he didn't want to get rid of slavery. He just didn't want it to spread to the other territories. So once he became the president, South Carolinians were like, we're out, we're seceding, we're leaving, or we're withdrawing, okay? So they held that secession convention. The South Carolina legislation called for a convention to determine the relationship between South Carolina and the Union. The convention met at the First Baptist Church in Columbia, but rumors of smallpox, which was very contagious, a smallpox outbreak led them to quickly and conveniently adjourn or stop the meeting and move to Charleston, where support for secession was the strongest. Now, this is something that I'd like to ask you, and I'm going to ask you this a little bit later in this presentation. If they would have stayed in Columbia, do we think South Carolina would have seceded if they didn't have a lot of support for secession at that particular location? It's a good question. We don't know whether or not they would have or would not have, okay? But it is something to consider. So, the Ordinance of Secession. When the meeting reconvened, the leaders unanimously adopted an Ordinance of Secession, meaning they wrote a law saying, or a statement saying that they were going to secede. This political statement said that the federal government should not interfere with the decision making and freedoms of individual states, or in other words, states' rights. So, again, the federal government and the state governments were at an impasse, or they, they weren't going to agree on this at this particular moment in time, just because South Carolina did not like the fact that Abraham Lincoln was in office and he got elected. Got elected again by electoral college, meaning he won the electoral college vote, not necessarily the popular vote. There were about 6 candidates running during the 1860 election, so the vote basically got split. Abraham Lincoln won the North, so therefore he became the president. Okay, and it's much kind of like how Donald Trump became the president, even though Hillary Clinton won the electoral college. Won the popular vote, and Donald Trump won the electoral college, so that therefore he became the president. All right, so this Ordinance of Secession again said that the federal government should not interfere with decision making and freedoms of individual states. So these states have rights, and this was their doctrine from the beginning, ever since John C. Calhoun, and before that, even with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison saying that states had rights under the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Okay? All right, so the Republican Party was a brand new party, so they had a policy on slavery. So, because Lincoln was a Republican and therefore opposed to slavery in the territories, not opposed to slavery, but only opposed to slavery in the territories, many Southerners assumed that the federal government would soon make slavery illegal. Remember, I told you guys, for the most part, things that happened in the early 1800s all the way up to the Civil War all hinged on the slave policy, all hinged on the issue of slavery and whether or not it was going to be able to spread throughout the United States. So ending slavery would in turn end Southern wealth, political influence, and their way of life. And if we look at the evidence in South Carolina now, ending slavery did hurt the Southern wealth, it hurt their political influence, and it ended that way of life, basically, the plantation system. Okay, without waiting for Lincoln to be inaugurated, they didn't wait for him to get in office. South Carolina and 6 other southern states seceded from the Union to protect the institution of slavery upon which their way of life depended. So again, they didn't even wait. This was December when they had the secession convention, and hopefully you'll get to do a little web quest at some point where you look at the secession convention. But this happened in December of 1860, I believe it was. December of 1860, they met, they seceded. Abraham Lincoln was not set to be inaugurated until January 20th in 1861. So, of course, we are on the precipice, or we are on the beginning. We're at the beginning of the Civil War in the United States, okay? Again, they didn't wait for him to be inaugurated. They just were like, we out. All right, so here's a couple of review questions that you want to make sure you're able to answer, okay? All right, so what was one major event that prompted South Carolina to secede from the Union? I just said what it was. Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president. Why do you believe that that was an issue? Again, you want to keep in mind that Abraham Lincoln was from the Republican Party. He did not want the slavery to spread onto soil that they considered to be free. So he didn't want the spread of slavery into the Western territories, all right? It's a major issue for South Carolina, and they felt like he was going to make slavery illegal. What does it mean to secede? That means to go off on your own or to break off ties. This usually refers to one part of the country that wants to be independent, for example, the South. So they withdrew from the Union and decided they'd set up their own government called the Confederate States of America. Didn't last, but they tried. What were the 3 major groups we've covered so far, and what did these groups believe? First one were Unionists. Hopefully you're repeating what they actually believed. Second up, we have the cooperationists and then the secessionists, who were radicals or fire eaters. So the unionists wanted to remain with the Union because they felt like that their rights would be protected under the Constitution. The cooperationists, who wanted to secede but only as a last resort and only if other southern states did the same thing. Yeah, secessionists, radicals, or fire eaters who wanted to secede since 1852, okay? Also, Charleston had a larger secessionist population. What do you think might have happened if the secession convention would have stayed in Columbia, and why? It's quite possible, again, that South Carolina might not have seceded had the convention remained in Columbia. Again, in Columbia, they had a smallpox scare, so they moved the convention down to Charleston. Charleston had a larger secessionist population, so they voted to secede, okay? All right, so do me a favor. Make sure you have all your notes. If you always need, this will be available for you to review, to hear me talk and ramble like I normally do. So, yeah,